So tell me about these funds that resulted in a congressional investigation where Chinese military was receiving U.S. tax dollars. If we weren't in the season of fraud everywhere, I would consider that incomprehensible. But now I'm like, yeah, sounds about right.
I think it's not just fraud, it's essentially a racket, right? We hear all these, members of Congress talking about how the Chinese Communist Party is our existential threat. Meanwhile, they're essentially approving, I guess in this case, at least not really doing anything about stopping millions of taxpayer dollars from flowing to China. I think it picks up quite nicely what Dr. Redfield was just talking about. Obviously, we did not learn our lessons from COVID-19 in the lens of, bio, whether they say it's defensive bio research or offensive in the case of Wuhan. But now we're seeing a lot of these kind of industries or vectors that the Trump administration is focusing on, and rightfully so, whether that's semiconductors or rare earths and critical minerals, which of course the Chinese Communist Party in their own text, their own 5-year plans, their own military strategy has identified these as sort of, not necessarily kinetic ways that they're trying to wage war against the United States, but really building up these domestic industries, onshoring production, and not just onshoring it, but dominating the markets. These are two areas where we've seen that happen kind of immensely, and certainly since Trump won. And what my investigation found, which, like you said, led to Congress now probing into it, is that there are dozens of studies that are concurrently being funded by US government entities and also basically the Chinese military counterpart in these respective fields. So if you look at the semiconductor thing, you're talking about the Institute of Semiconductors of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And that one's particularly egregious. The US Army, not even just, the NIH or the National Science Foundation, was actually funding research that was being conducted by this group that their basically sole purpose is to help China dominate the whole semiconductor industry. But what's also really concerning, and I know Susan has talked about this a lot, but this idea of money flowing to American researchers who are sort of double dipping through the 100 Talents or 1,000 Talents program, so which has been flagged by the United States government as basically not just espionage, but straight up IP theft, just absolutely robbing the United States of everything that gives us a scientific edge. And the United States government is funding 1,000 Talents researchers working for the Chinese military. It's not conspiracy. You can see it very clearly on these research papers. And like I was saying, in the rare earth aspect, you're talking about China's, it's what is called their State Key Laboratory of Rare Earth Materials, Chemistry, and Applications. Quite a long word, but this entity has dozens of studies that the United States government, whether through the National Science Foundation, a lot of times it's coming from the Department of Energy, that's probably the worst offender, where they're funding what the United States internalizes as sort of innocent or innocuous research, but in reality, it's not just military civil fusion, it's outright military application.
So somebody asked me something earlier in the show when I was talking to Jeremy, which was, what's happened to Doge? Has it just been declawed? Is it still underway? Do they need a driver like a relentless Musk in place to be able to do anything? Are they still around?
They're not. It's been a few months since I think they have died, to use a term. And I will say, I don't think it's any secret where the war room, where our audience falls in terms of supporting President Trump. Our audience, a lot of grassroots people helped get him elected, but I think they helped to try to get him elected on this message of accountability. And while the Trump administration has had some really good rhetoric on, stopping the fraud, ending the abuse, take your pick, I think there is a lot of room, a lot of desire still left on actual ramifications being seen,
oh my God, yes.
Not just for the people who are misusing the funds, but more so for the people who allowed it to happen, right? The people who had the positions of power. It's not just about deporting illegal aliens. It's about holding accountable the NGOs, people like Secretary Mayorkas, the people who actually enabled it to happen. So I don't know where that accountability has gone. I'm glad Congress is now all of a sudden investigating, this stuff. But on the other hand, I mean, how many actual meaningful issues die in the halls of Congress? I mean, virtually all of them, whatever comes out of their committees, not much. So, I'm not necessarily holding my breath. I think the issue is that the reason why people talk so much about China is not because they want to do anything. It's because it's a really nice bipartisan talking point that allows them to basically balloon the defense budget not that that's its own discussion to have, but there's not really
You have,
anything super meaningful that you see in
I think it's
return.
probably been 6 or 8 months since I last talked to you, and you've turned more pessimistic since I last spoke to you.
I'm
Not
too
even
black pilled,
it's
I
a deeper
know.
word than pessimism. It's like you've lost faith. You've lost faith that we can do something here. But I know this has got to be in your crosshairs. But China has been saying in the new year some very scary things about Taiwan. I'm feeling a Substack coming my way, but without telling us too much, so people still have to read that. What are your thoughts?
Well, I actually had the honor and absolute privilege of interviewing the vice president of Taiwan a few months ago. Not a Substack exclusive, was an X exclusive, and he streamed it on War Room. And I essentially, talked to her about that. Obviously, the DPP being in power there, I think they share, in some ways, what is MAGA's understanding of the Chinese Communist Party. They view them as the existential threat, and they're doing everything they can. To establish, to practice, to build up deterrence. But they have a lot of internal opposition too, as many stories as I can write here about, whether it's the United Front Work Department, the myriad of people who are just in some cases on the payroll of the Chinese Communist Party, or various kind of proxy entities. They have it tenfold. And I always think that that's why Americans should really watch what is going on in Taiwan with a very, very close eye, because they are sort of on the front lines of really kinetic Chinese Communist Party aggression. But the key there is that it's not just the kinetic action that should scare us. It's sort of the gray zone hybrid stuff that you see in the lead up to it, whether it's election interference, whether it's cyber attacks, whether it's propaganda, information, misinformation. I use those terms in their actual definitional sense, not the way that they've been distorted here. But you really can learn some lessons about the kind of playbook that they've rolled out there. And also this, kind of narrative framing that America is not a reliable ally. That's, I think, probably the most powerful message that we've seen the Chinese Communist Party push there. But like I said, the ruling power there, at least from the president perspective within their legislature, it's a little bit of a different story. They have a political party, the KMT, that is pretty, I think, open in their, kind of efforts to, at least not, I guess, not even back channel, to outright channel with the Chinese Communist Party. But I think that it's actually quite an interesting political dynamic over there, because, like I was saying, the PRC infiltration is what everything we got going on here. It's worse. But yeah, maybe a forthcoming Substack. But I encourage people to watch the interview. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, the one thing you can rely on the Chinese Communist Party to do is not waste energy doing any sort of kinetic action if they don't have to. And so they lay the table very, systematically and carefully. And when I heard some of the rhetoric, I don't know if you heard this today, I heard some of it, where they're like, well, by the end of the year, we'll have Taiwan, is sort of what they were saying. And they were sort of alleging that it would be a kinetic takeover. And I thought, no, they'll just walk in one day. And they may be right. America is not a reliable ally against that kind of thing. Certainly not future administrations necessarily.
Well, yeah, that's always, I think, the downside, right, of the 4-year term. And to be honest, not that I'm being jaded or blackpilled. I think I'm
Which
being
you
quite
are.
accurate. But but I think the Trump administration's tone on China has significantly shifted from Trump one. I think the way that he is engaging with them, you can see it in his rhetoric. But I think if you also look to his actions, it's not viewing them as the existential threat that I think he spoke about them as on the campaign. I mean, you even see it in the national security strategy, not just that they're refusing to call China out, despite calling out countries that engage in not just the authoritarian human rights abuses, but, currency manipulation, IP theft, the trade practices, seeking to basically dominate all of our manufacturing industries. But I think you see it in just how he engages with Xi Jinping, even the fact that he's going to Beijing and Xi Jinping is not coming here, and the deals that they're cutting with the semiconductors, the chips, giving things that I think a Trump one, not just President Trump, but a cabinet and a lot of the China, the kind of China desk, certainly the NSC, would have not approved. Again, we're just about a year into the administration, and I don't think that they've gone totally soft on China, but I think that
Yeah.
there is a market shift.
But I would say it looks to me, and this is my humble sort of naive opinion, that I'm excited to bring you a new product, a new supplement, Fatty. I take it. I make Susan take it. My whole family takes it. This comes out of, believe it or not, dolphin research. The Navy maintains a fleet of dolphins, and a brilliant veterinarian recognized that these dolphins sometimes developed a syndrome identical to our Alzheimer's disease. Those dolphins were deficient in a particular fatty acid. She replaced the fatty acid, and they didn't get the Alzheimer's. Humans have the same issue, and we are more deficient in this particular fatty acid than ever before. And a simple replacement of this fatty acid called C15 will help us prevent these syndromes. It's published in a recent journal called Metabolites. It's a new nutritional C15, pentadecanoic acid it's called. The deficiency that we are developing for C15 creates something called the cellular fragility syndrome. This is the first nutritional deficiency syndrome to be discovered in 75 years and may be affecting us in many ways, and as many as 1 in 3 of us. This is an important breakthrough. Take advantage of it. Go to fatty15.com/Dr. Drew to receive 15% off a 90-day starter kit subscription, or use code Dr. Drew at checkout for that 15% off, or just go to our website, drdrew.com/fatty15. This is my humble sort of naive opinion that they're bringing everything stateside. They're taking it all back from China, all the manufacturing and whatnot that they can. And so that they can be more liberal with the actions they take against China without having dire consequences on our economy here. And it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong on this, that somebody, Rubio is doing I think he's doing a very good job. And it seems to me he would be making it clear to China that if they went to Taiwan, it would not just be us. It would be Japan, Korea, Indonesia, Philippines. We would all line up against them. Is that wrong?
Well, I think that's what they've been working towards. I think you see that with the expanding alliances in the region. Obviously, the legislature over there is in the midst of debating their sort of defense spending packages. And like I said, there's a lot of internal opposition holding there, which the only reason why that is so important is because I think you have to contextualize that inside of the sort of America First, the idea where we will meet you right where you are. We're not just going to send out, to use a term, pallets of cash to countries in exchange for nothing. But I think that the DPP has demonstrated that they're willing to do that. But I also think too, you have to not you, but just in general, I mean, the Trump administration, to some extent, their hands are also pretty heavily tied when you see the way China has leveraged their monopoly on what we were just talking about, the rare earths, right? There's only so much that the Trump administration can even do. And that was, I think, really the downside of the 4 years of Joe Biden, because in that interregnum period between phase 1 of the Trump-China trade war, which I don't even like that terminology because that's victim blaming, right? It's China that's been waging that. But China basically set out in those 4 years, they increased their efforts to shore up basically a upwards of 90% monopoly, not just on critical minerals and rare earths themselves, but more importantly, the processing. So even if the Trump administration wanted to do, 100% more, their hands really are tied. And what was described as the nuclear option, it was when they threatened to basically pull all of the processing. And that's an important distinction. It's not just the minerals, it's also the processing. But that's why it's so complicated
but they're trying to work on that. And Greenland has a lot of those rare earth minerals after all. Let's pay attention to that. But before we kind of wind things down here, what else is on your radar these days?
Well, I got super radicalized with everything that is going on in Minnesota, as I'm sure your viewers have too. I think that's a great example. Like I say, it's not just fraud. I think it's a racket. And before we get into maybe some of the stories that I've done, the political ties linking it to ActBlue, there was a series of grants. I just think it's quite illustrative of the problem going on there that were distributed, I believe, in 2023, because there was a problem where dozens of these Somali migrants would come to Minnesota, and then they would go and join terrorist groups in the Middle East. And the Minnesota government and federal government's response was, instead of saying maybe we should stop importing a bunch of potential terrorists, is actually, no, we're going to launch a federal pilot program whereby we're going to use hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars to give it to Somali community organizations where these terrorists are coming from and try to stop them from creating terrorists. Now, that sounds like a really complex way of solving a very simple problem, which is that Minnesota probably just doesn't need more Somalians, let alone Somalians' pipelines into becoming terrorists in countries that are attacking the United States. But obviously, I'm sure by now everyone has seen the videos. Obviously, Nick Shirley did a great investigation. But I think if you take this to its logical conclusion, and what is, I think, even the more damning story, it's how this links into the political apparatus, the Democrat political machine, because obviously so many of these centers had dozens, in some cases nearly 100 flagrant violations from the government for basically being fake companies. And what you see when you look into some of these groups, one of these groups, Issaroon, for example, which got $3 million to just renovate a new building. It was in bill text. It wasn't even appropriation. They created a special session to give them millions of dollars. The founder of it also runs a PAC called the Somali American Women Political Action Committee, where they're doling out thousands of dollars just because of campaign regulations. I'm sure it's probably more, to a bunch of Democrats in the state, including but not limited to Keith Ellison, while also hosting events alongside Tim Walz. The lady spoke alongside Tim Walz at the inaugural Somali Day at the Capitol in 2023. Meanwhile, their PAC, same lady who's receiving millions of government grants, they're pumping out money to support candidates who are helping to combat the dehumanization of Muslims, to support equity, to end racism, and advocate for refugee and reproductive rights. I don't think that's bipartisan. I think you call that a racket.
Racket. And speaking of being black-pilled, the fact that people defend or push back on the investigations, that black-pills me. I can't believe some of these asshole journalists and asshole politicians. They're truly showing themselves to be just that. Their job is to govern and to use our dollars effectively, and they've clearly failed, and they should adjust course. Good, but not pretend it's not happening or blame the victims, which are the taxpayers.
Well, in some cases, you have Politico journalists, quote tweeting Nick Shirley saying that all the Somalis in Minnesota should learn about, stand your ground laws. I mean, maybe we can appreciate that he's advocating assimilation, but I think that's probably the only time a Politico reporter has ever said, anything assimilating to American values is not racist. But I mean, it just goes to what I was saying in the beginning. There's no demonstrable value add to these communities from a bunch of, backwards third world cultures that are failed states, especially when they're stealing more in billions of dollars from the United States government than the actual GDP.
I'll actually push back on that, but because I don't want to blame these people. I want to blame the people that handed them the money. And of course they do what they do. You know what I mean? That's not their fault. That's the people that handed them the money's fault. They're the ones that are handling my money and proving then again and again and again that they are the worst allocator of capital on the planet. And I don't understand why everybody doesn't understand that. This is just further evidence of that.
Well, I think because no one's ever been held to account. And I think if you play this story out from beginning to end, which is, how did a bunch of Somalians even end up in Minnesota, right? And why this town? And if you trace the money, you'll find not just that it's these left-wing NGOs, but it's these sort of, globalist multilateral institutions, whether it's the World Health Organization, through the lens of health equity, the United Nations, these, migrant rights groups, they're all euphemistic terms, right? They're right. It's modern day human trafficking through a different lens. And a lot of these, so-called charities are also simultaneously fundraising on ActBlue. And a lot of those charities that are involved with border work in the United States are also fundraising on ActBlue. And it just makes you wonder where exactly all this dark money is coming from, because I don't think, as woke as the people of Minnesota may be, that they want their tax dollars to be going to this.
Well, I would love you to stay hot on that trail, and we will look to you to do that. You're our source, and we appreciate it. Natalie G. Winters on X.
I have a question.
War Room is where they will find you.
I don't want her to go.
Yeah, I'm not going to send her go. I want to make sure. Is there anywhere else you want people to go before Susan asks her question?
That's all. And Susan, I love how passionate you are about the Chinese Communist Party. We need more people like you.
Well, I watch, I look at X and Instagram and I see a lot of these fake like news things about China and Venezuela, and maybe, they're going in to pick up oil because Trump said they couldn't have the oil, and then they're bombing Venezuela, and then there's, the Chinese are behind it because they want the oil and blah, blah, blah. And I want to know what your take is on that, especially personally, because I may be on an island really close to Venezuela soon, and I want to make sure it's safe. Because if there's a war, I'm not going to fly over there.
Well, I would be very careful. I'm not the person to be asking on that front. Obviously they, not just through the Belt and Road, but in general, they've really expanded their control over that entire continent. But I think that the bigger point is too, I think we've seen so many American military resources, more from a kinetic angle, be redeployed and positioned there through the lens of, focusing on the Western Hemisphere. But I think, as we've discussed on War Room many times, and I'm sure, Susan, to some extent, you maybe share my view on this too, I think the existential threat is the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that the front line of that fight, it is a misdirection play to make it Venezuela or to make it, third order, fourth order countries, when Taiwan and that region actually having resources there, I think is the better way to deter. And I think if we had a stronger posture there, that in a weird way, even though it's regionally different, I think you'd probably be safer going there. I'm always a fan of traveling, so you should go, but I'm probably not the person to ask.
Natalie for State Department.
That's exactly what I thought. I was like, this is all a Chinese thing. I know it is, but yeah, I don't know. I just worry about that for everybody. Because
yeah, of course. There will be no peace, Natalie, now. So thank you for that.
I know. Now I'm like,
so in this household, I'm talking about it when we travel.
We're going to be really close to San Juan, Puerto Rico, so we can get away.
Oh, tell her this. The military is there a lot of military stationed in Puerto Rico? I don't know that to be so. I know I know they've moved resources into the region, but I don't think about Puerto Rico as being a major outlet.
Military hub.
Are they?
I think it's more repositioning of ships.
Yeah. Yes.
So yes. I think for now, maybe they're spared, but who knows?
Thank you. You turn the heat down a little bit right there. So, okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, if I can get off the island and get onto, safe ground. I don't want to be in a no-fly zone.
If you get off the island and onto an aircraft carrier, you'll be fine. Okay, fine. A passing destroyer or something, if you can get on that'd be great.
I mean, if it could start in February, that would be much better, because we're going to the end of January.
Oh, Natalie, we appreciate it so much that you're on top of these stories. We appreciate you sharing them with us here, and we'll look for you at the War Room and your Substack. Ask Dr. Drew is produced by Caleb Nation and Susan Pinsky. Emily Barsh is our content producer. As a reminder, the discussions here are not a substitute for medical care, diagnosis, or treatment. This show is intended for educational and informational purposes only. I am a licensed physician, but I am not a replacement for your personal doctor, and I am not practicing medicine here. Always remember that our understanding of medicine and science is constantly evolving. Though my opinion is based on the information that is available to me today, some of the contents of this show could be outdated in the future. Be sure to check with trusted resources in case any of the information has been updated since this was published. If you or someone you know is in immediate danger, don't call me, call 911. If you're feeling hopeless or suicidal, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 800-273-8255. You can find more of my recommended organizations and helpful resources at drdrew.com/help.